of others by a law enforcement officer. That's what this case is about, simply put. It's been a long trial. You've heard a lot of evidence. You've seen a lot of witnesses. I want to thank each and every one of you for taking your duty as a juror as seriously as you have. It's a huge obligation, but it's also a cornerstone of what makes our free democratic society what it is. It's so important that the right to a trial by jury is enshrined in both the U.S. Constitution and in the Hawaii State Constitution. What you are doing, again, forms the basis of our free society. For someone like Special Agent Deedy to be judged by a jury of his peers. And so we thank you for that obligation and the continuing duty that you have through this process. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the jury instructions. But before we go there, I want to talk a little bit about some of the basic things in this case. There is no doubt that Special Agent Deedy shot and killed Colin Elders. That's a fact, and nobody disputes it. But that does not mean that Special Agent Deedy murdered Colin Elders. Special Agent Deedy's intent was not to kill Colin Elders. His intent was to protect life. His intent was to stop the threat of serious bodily injury and deadly force that Colin Elders presented. That was his intent. The prosecution cannot prove that beyond a reasonable doubt. But in addition, we have the three separate defenses that are listed in your jury instructions. And I want to go through just a few of those things with you from your jury instructions. On page 29 of your jury instructions, we look at the first of those three separate defenses. On page 29, you'll see at the very top, the first word is self-defense. This is the self-defense instruction. And if you go down to the second paragraph where it talks about deadly force, and you go down to the third line of that paragraph, it says, intentionally firing a firearm in the direction of another person or in the direction which the person is believed to be constitutes deadly force. That's clear. Nobody has any doubts about that. Look at that in conjunction with the next sentence. A threat to cause death or serious bodily injury by the production of a weapon or otherwise, so long as the actor's intent is limited to creating an apprehension that he will use deadly force if necessary, does not constitute deadly force. I want you to think about that when you think about what Special Agent Deedy did with his firearm over the course of that evening. If you turn to the next page, and we look at the top paragraph, and we go down to the end of the third line, and again, this is on page 30. It says, the reasonableness of the defendant's belief that the use of deadly force was immediately necessary shall be determined from the viewpoint of a reasonable person in the defendant's position under the circumstances of which the defendant was aware, or as the defendant reasonably believed them to be when the deadly force was used. That's key in assessing the self-defense here. It's taken from the point of view of a reasonable person in Special Agent Deedy's position, knowing what was known to him at the time. That's how the standard is applied. And then if you go down to the second paragraph from the bottom, still on page 30, it says, when the defendant is a law enforcement officer justified in using force in performance of his duties, or is a person justified in making an arrest, the defendant is not obliged to desist from efforts to perform the duty or to effect the arrest because of resistance or threatened resistance by or on behalf of the person against whom the action is directed. A law enforcement officer doing that which is lawful for a law enforcement officer to do has no obligation to desist from that activity. The instruction makes that clear. We turn to page 31. This is the second defense instruction, and this is regard to defense of others. Again, it has that right at the top of the line. Notice that this instruction, like the self-defense instruction, has the same language about deadly force, the exact same second paragraph. And then if we turn the page to page 32 and we look at the last paragraph, it has the very same language about the defendant being a law enforcement officer. These are key provisions to consider. And lastly, we get to the third defense. Third defense begins on page 34 of your instructions. And this is use of force in law enforcement. This instruction, again, has the exact same deadly force provision in the second paragraph. But then, this instruction is a little bit different. You look at the very bottom of page 34. It begins 5 numbered paragraphs. And I just want to read those 5 numbered paragraphs in the following one to you. Number 1, it says, so we're looking at when this defense applies. The individual, according to paragraph 1, is making a lawful arrest for a felony which the defendant reasonably believes involved conduct including the use or threatened use of deadly force, or the defendant reasonably believes that there is a substantial risk that the person to be arrested will cause death or serious bodily injury if his apprehension is delayed. That's the first one there. Go to number 2. Reasonably believes that deadly force is immediately necessary to effect a lawful arrest. Number 3, makes known the purpose of the arrest or reasonably believes that the purpose of the arrest is otherwise known by or cannot reasonably be made known to the person to be arrested. 4, is authorized to act as a law enforcement officer. 5, reasonably believes that the force employed creates no substantial risk of injury to innocent persons. And then the following paragraph, this one, the reasonableness is slightly different than what we see in the previous 2 instructions. Here, it notes that the reasonableness is taken from the viewpoint of a reasonable law enforcement officer. So it specifically includes the concept that Special Agent Deedy, as a law enforcement officer, has a different perspective from what we see in those previous instructions. And that's critical in looking at those jury instructions. Now, the other key jury instruction that Judge Ahn read to you, she talks about reasonable doubt. And reasonable doubt is difficult to define, but there are some concepts that are very clear about reasonable doubt. And that is, most fundamentally, that reasonable doubt is the highest standard of proof in our entire system of justice. There are many other standards, and you've heard some of them talked about. You've heard about probable cause, what a police officer needs to know in order to effect an arrest. Okay? That's essentially the lowest standard of proof in our justice system. And then there are other standards of proof that go up from there, things that don't apply in this courtroom necessarily. We talk about a preponderance evidence. In other words, anything more than 50%. We talk about clear and convincing evidence. But reasonable doubt is beyond even those. Reasonable doubt is the single highest standard of proof in our justice system. And that is the standard that must be applied in this case. Now, let's talk about the facts of this case. The prosecution brought in a number of expert witnesses as if this were some sort of a CSI case, as if it was a whodunit. There's no doubt that Special Agent Deedy is the one who shot and killed Colin Eldridge. That is clear. We don't need DNA analysis. We don't need gunshot residue to determine that Colin Eldridge and Special Agent Deedy were both in the vicinity of the gun when it was fired. All of that is clear from the video. But what we don't have, the one thing that might have been helpful, is a trajectory analysis. He said, we didn't need to do it because there's only one shooter. The one piece of scientific evidence that might have shed some real light on this wasn't done. Now, let's talk about the evidence of intoxication that we find in this case. Special Agent Deedy testified. He said he had roughly 4 beers over the course of the entire evening, some of which even went into a flip cup game. So actually somewhat less than that. But then let's look at the testimony of the other people. We had very early in the trial, we had Miss Barbette, the bartender from Coconut Willie's. She was the one who tabbed Special Agent Deedy out when he left Coconut Willie's. She's the last person at that bar, other than the people that he's with, Jessica West and Adam Gutowski, who saw him when he left. And what did we learn about her? She's trained as a bartender to recognize signs of intoxication. Why? Because she has an obligation as a bartender not to overserve people. If she does, if she serves someone who's intoxicated, she could be liable. The bar that she works for could be liable. She has an absolute obligation to understand when someone is intoxicated. And what did she say? She saw no signs of intoxication in Special Agent Deedy. And she wasn't across the room like Taylor Al-Young was, claiming to see glassy eyes. She was across the bar, maybe 3 feet away from Special Agent Deedy. She, a trained person on this issue, saw no signs of intoxication. The prosecution brought Officer Hosaka to the stand. And Officer Hosaka talked about how he saw Special Agent Deedy with red and glassy eyes. He was the one, remember, that transported Special Agent Deedy from the McDonald's to the hospital, where photos were taken. And then we showed him those photographs. And he had to admit that those photographs did not show red and glassy eyes. They were clear. Each one of you saw those photographs, and you'll be able to review them again back in the deliberation room. By the time we got to the 4th photograph with Officer Hosaka, in an act of desperation, he tried to point to a spot in the corner and say, oh, there's a little red there. Those are not red and glassy eyes. And then what else did Officer Hosaka say? He said that Special Agent Deedy couldn't walk very steady. He was unsteady as he walked. But then we showed him the Maish video. He had to admit that there was no sign that Special Agent Deedy was unsteady, that he was swaying. There was nothing there. The actual evidence that we have, the photographs, the video, contradicts what Officer Hosaka claims he saw. Officer IU had to admit, Special Agent Deedy, nothing unusual about his walk. He walked normally. Mikhail Perrine. At first, his testimony was that Special Agent Deedy was intoxicated. But what did he have to admit, ultimately? That it was an assumption. And what was that assumption based on? The fact that it was 2:30 a.m. on Kukiu Avenue. That was it. He didn't actually see any signs of intoxication. He just made an assumption. Alexander Byrd claimed that Special Agent Deedy couldn't even stand up straight. Said he couldn't even keep his eyes open. But we show him the McDonald's video. Oh, well, it wasn't there that he couldn't stand up straight. It was somewhere else. We don't see anywhere on the McDonald's video where Special Agent Deedy can't stand up straight, except when he gets punched to the ground by Colin Elders. But yet, and Alexander Byrd only has interaction with Special Agent Deedy at the McDonald's. There's nowhere else that he has interaction. And yet, he wants us to believe that he couldn't stand up straight, that he couldn't even keep his eyes open because he was so intoxicated. Taylor Al-Young, her claims of glassy eyes. She claims she's seated so that she's looking away from the interaction. She looks over her shoulder from a distance of over 20 feet with any number of people moving around and says she can see glassy eyes from across that McDonald's. Something she had never told the police about before. This is new in her testimony here. And then we have Toy Steck, the evidence technician. She claims that she could smell an odor of alcohol, both from Special Agent Deedy's breath and from his body. But this report somehow doesn't get generated until January of 2013. It's an act of desperation to try to generate some evidence of intoxication against Special Agent Deedy. And it's an act of desperation because there is none. Dr. Perry testified. No signs of intoxication. Nurse Nakamura from the emergency room testified. No signs of intoxication. She specifically, Dr. Perry, his memory was, he relied on his report, but Nurse Nakamura had clear memories of what had happened. She knew there was no odor of alcohol. She knew that his speech was clear. She saw him walk within that emergency room. His walk was steady. There was no swaying. There were no problems. That's the evidence of intoxication that we have. And it's clear given that evidence, that Special Agent Deedy was not intoxicated. Now, the prosecution wants you to think that Special Agent Deedy did something wrong as soon as he consumed a single sip of alcohol because he was carrying his firearm. And they argue that the FAM, what's been marked, what's in evidence as State's Exhibit 31, applies to him on duty. But remember the testimony of Special Agent Golbus. He's the actual designated rep from the State Department to come and testify as to policy issues for the State Department. And what did he say? The FAM, the Foreign Affairs Manual, applies when an agent is on duty. That's when it applies. And what else did he testify to? When an agent is off duty, the Law Enforcement Officer Safety Act applies. And that's actually found, if you look in your jury instructions, at page 22 is the instruction that's based off that Law Enforcement Officer Safety Act. It makes clear that a special agent is not prevented from consuming alcohol while carrying a firearm. He's prevented from being under the influence of alcohol while carrying a firearm. That's the policy that applies when a Special Agent Duty chooses to carry a firearm off duty. Because note that he was not carrying his issued firearm. Special Agent Golbus did talk about the fact that if he was carrying his issued firearm, the FAM would apply, but he wasn't. Under the circumstances that Special Agent Deedy was in, carrying his own personal firearm off duty, it was the Law Enforcement Officer Safety Act that applied. It's interesting to note also in the Foreign Affairs Manual, it has a provision, and again, you'll have this back in the deliberation room, so you can look at it. But it has a portion at the end, and it says, disclaimer, these regulations are set forth solely for the purpose of internal departmental guidance. They are not intended to, do not, and may not be relied upon to create any rights, substantive or procedural, enforceable at law by any party in any matter, civil or criminal. And they do not place any limitations on otherwise lawful activities of this department. The Foreign Affairs Manual applies to Special Agent Deedy when he's on duty. There's no doubt. Special Agent Golbus made that clear. But when he is off duty, it's the Law Enforcement Officer Safety Act that applies to him, and he complied with it. He had beer, and that's not a violation of LEOSA, of the Law Enforcement Officer Safety Act. He was not under the influence. That's the key. Now, we have some information about other intoxication that's also very relevant in this case. Colin Eldert's blood alcohol at the time that it was measured is a .127. So we know that his blood alcohol was at least that at the time of the shooting. The doctors testified because of the IV fluids and things like that, his blood alcohol concentration could have been diluted, but it would have been at least a .127 at the time of the shooting. We know that he had recently used cocaine and marijuana. Dr. Dialwis and Dr. Arden testified about how rapidly cocaine breaks down in the body, and even once Dr. Arden testified to how quickly it can break down even once it's been removed as a sample. Colin Elderts had used cocaine recently. Ms. Fuda even had to admit the McDonald's video shows how clearly that Colin Elderts is in this exuberant mood, as she put it. But how does Colin Elderts react when Special Agent Deedy identifies himself? What does a rational person do when a law enforcement officer identifies themselves? They don't get angry. They don't get furious. They don't start yelling at the police officer like Colin Elderts did. They listen to the law enforcement officer, they see what's going on, and they move on with their business. But that's not what Colin Elderts does. He ratchets up. And because he has the effects of alcohol and illicit drugs, that Dr. Arden testified to can have what's called a potentiating effect. A 1 + 1 = 3. So combining those substances makes the situation far worse. And the presence of the cocaethylene was one of the chemicals that both Dr. Arden and Dr. Diallo testified to, shows that the cocaine and the alcohol were being ingested in the body at the same time. Now, let's talk a little bit about what happens, how this whole thing gets started with Mikhail Perrine. Mikhail Perrine testified, and Ms. Fuda pointed this out, that he didn't feel threatened, that he shrugged it off. But what did he remember at the time he gave his statement to the police? He had to admit that when he originally gave his statement to the police, he didn't think he had seen a fight. He didn't think he had seen a weapon fired. He was so intoxicated, he had no memory of anything that happened that night. He reviewed the video, and all of a sudden now he has memories of what happened. His original statements to the police officers make it clear. He was so intoxicated, he has no idea what happened. So his statements now, I shrugged it off. I didn't feel threatened. Those are fictions. That's what he wants to see when he looks at that video. He doesn't want to think that he was threatened, that he was vulnerable. No one would. It's understandable. But the reality is, at the time, immediately after the shooting, he had no recollection of any of the events. Events that happened literally feet in front of him. He's sitting at that table on the side of McDonald's. Colin Elderts is driving Special Agent Deedy to the ground, and he has no recollection of it. After the shots go off, we see the reactions of the McDonald's workers behind the cashier counter. We see them cover their ears. We see them move back. They lurch back. Mikhail Perrine, his reaction is delayed by at least 3 seconds before he finally gets up. His brain is not processing like a normal human being at that point. He's so intoxicated. Brendalyn Saltzbrenner admitted that she had to tell Colin Elderts to stop what he was doing with regard to Mikhail Perrine. She, as a cashier, felt she had to get involved and say something to him. Alexander Bird got on the stand and tried to suggest that there was no staring between Mikhail Perrine and Shane Medeiros and Colin Elderts, that it was somehow either Special Agent Deedy or Adam Gutowski that were doing the staring. A complete fiction. Every other witness contradicts that concept of what happened. Rosalinda Soriano, the security guard of the McDonald's, she made it very clear that Colin Elderts was harassing Mikhail Perrine. There's no doubt. She saw Special Agent Deedy approach, and she could tell that he was concerned for the situation. He was not someone who was trying to make the situation worse. He was concerned about the situation, and he got involved. She made it clear that Colin Elderts and Shane Medeiros, those were the ones. Those were the two who started the problem with their interactions with Mikhail Perrine. The prosecution wants you to think that Special Agent Deedy was afraid of hostile locals. There's no evidence of that. His body language, as he approaches Colin Elderts, could not be more relaxed. He goes up to that table, if this is the table, his hands in his pockets, like this. It's the most relaxed body posture you could conceivably have. There's no aggression there. There's no fear. He's completely relaxed because he has no aggression at that point. He's just stepping in to say, hey, lay off this guy. That's all he's doing. Now, it's interesting the way that the prosecution has characterized a variety of things. In particular, they refer to Colin Elderts as a loud, obnoxious kid. Colin Elderts is not a kid. He's an adult. He's 23 years old. Been arrested by the police before, as you heard Sergeant Wayne Fernandez testify to, and he had resisted arrest.
Your Honor, objection.
Sustained.
Move to strike.
I'll strike that
sanction.
last argument. Jury will disregard it.
The testimony, as Judge Ahn instructed you, that you heard from Wayne Fernandez, you're allowed to consider that testimony specifically for the purpose of determining who the first aggressor in this situation is. The court gave you a specific instruction that you're allowed to consider Wayne Fernandez's testimony to that issue. The prosecution, when they talk about what Shane Medeiros said to Mikhail Perrine, said, they quote Shane Medeiros as saying, "What are you looking at? It's all over." That's not what Shane Medeiros said on the stand. He said, "You still have a fucking problem?" You heard the tone in his voice. He still had the exact same tone that he did that night. He couldn't even control it as he recounted the events. That's what Shane Medeiros said to Mikhail Perrine. That's the tone that he used. That's the way they singled out Mikhail Perrine. The prosecution relied extensively on the testimony of Alexander Byrd during their closing argument. This is the same Alexander Byrd who is contradicted over and over again by his previous statements. His statements to the detectives and his sworn statements before the grand jury. He said, "Oh, I don't read the media. I don't read the media. No way." All of a sudden, grand jury testimony, it says you got these names from the media. "Oh, well, in that case, yeah, I read the news in that case." His statements changed every single time. They were completely inconsistent. What he said on the stand was completely inconsistent with almost everything he had said before. He claimed that he had protected a girl and grabbed her with him into the corner, and that he ran out with her. He ran out by himself. But the biggest one of all, from Alexander Byrd, he gave us this gripping detail of what he saw while Colin Eldridge was on top of Special Agent Deedy. He talked about how he could see where the hands are. He could see all their bodies from the waist up, from behind that toy display. But what had he told the detectives only days after the incident? He said he couldn't see anything from behind the toy display. Nothing. Now he comes into court and gives us all this great detail. That's not testimony you can believe. Brendolyn Saltzbrenner said that she saw blood on Colin Eldridge's shirt. She also claimed that she saw a lot of other things. She claimed that she was the one who gave Special Agent Deedy extra sauce packets for the chicken McNuggets when he came up to the counter. We played the video. It wasn't her. It was one of the other cashiers. It didn't come from the front of the counter like she said that she had provided. It came from the back of the counter. She wants to believe that she remembers these things, but she doesn't. And that's just, human memory can be that way. I would not suggest that she falls into the category of Alexander Byrd, but she was there at the McDonald's. She wants to believe that she remembers these things. But the evidence shows that her memories are not accurate. We can pull up the Defense Exhibit A and bring it to the front dining view, please, at 2:40:45. State's Exhibit 7 are Special Agent Deedy's credentials. He had them that night. They were recovered by the Honolulu Police Department during their investigation. If we look at the video, and here we're at 2:40:45, and if we can, we're going to just go frame by frame here. We notice right here we've got Special Agent Deedy standing at Colin Eldridge's table. Colin Eldridge is seated. Got Shane Medeiros over here. He's still having a conversation with Alexander Byrd. If we go to the next frame. Again, notice Special Agent Deedy's posture. His hands are in his pocket. He's completely relaxed. Next frame. Reaches back in his right pocket. Right like that. Next frame, please. He's bending over, still reaching. Next frame. He's now got his hands like this. He's got his hands like this. That's how he has it. Shane Medeiros at this point has walked up. Jessica West is at his side, just a little behind him. Next frame. And what does he do? He opens up his credentials. He shows his badge. There's no doubt about what happened there. Detective Boyle, when he had to admit on the stand that he had noted in his report that Special Agent Deedy badged Elderts, you could almost see the pain on Detective Boyle's face that he had to admit that it happened. But it did. Nothing else is going on here. The prosecution tries to suggest, well, Jessica West didn't even see it happen. What Jessica West said, she's honest enough to say what she saw actually happen. She saw Special Agent Deedy pull something out. It looked like a black wallet. She's standing back here. If he opens and shows the badge, she can't see the badge from back here. She's just being honest. If she really was trying to pitch in for her friend, she'd say, oh, I saw the badge. That's what she would say, but she's honest enough to say what she actually saw. Shane Medeiros, during his testimony on cross-examination, he admitted, while we were looking at this portion of the video, he made it clear that he had an unobstructed view of what Special Agent Deedy was doing. There was nothing in his way. He could see him perfectly, and he admits that he's right there at the table, which the video clearly shows. But then what did he say? He did not see him identify himself as a law enforcement officer. The video could not make it more clear. Shane Medeiros cannot bring himself to admit that he knows that at this point, Chris Deedy is a law enforcement officer. Now, there's been a lot of talk about command presence. Detectives Boyle and Coons want to say the only way to do it is come in loud, go high, police, police, I'm here. That's what they suggest. Ms. Fuda talked about one of the examples that Fabian Liu shared about his experience while he was a Honolulu Police Department officer. He talked about the church incident where there was a disturbance. He went back, quietly identified himself, took the individual out of the church, didn't call 911, just addressed the situation. Turns out that someone else called 911 that situation. But what she didn't talk about was the other example he shared with us. Another situation where he was in plain clothes. He talked about when RIMPAC had come to Honolulu. We've got all these military guys that he talked about. He was in plain clothes. He saw an incident going down at Coconut Willie's, of all ironic places for it to happen at. And he goes in loud. He goes, Honolulu police. And what immediately happened when he did that? Boom, the guy rips his shirt off and they get into a fight. The loud approach to command presence is not always the right approach. It is a judgment call, a considered judgment by a law enforcement officer who assesses the situation and decides, what do I think is the best situation given what I know? We don't judge law enforcement officers with 20/20 hindsight. They can't have perfect knowledge. They can't know that Colin Elderts would get furious when Special Agent Deedy identifies himself as a law enforcement officer. A law enforcement officer has a reasonable expectation that a citizen in a McDonald's, when confronted with that badge, with that show of authority, will reasonably comply when he says, hey, just knock it off. That's what makes sense. Now, I want to take the video, if we can, to the front dining view at 2:40 and 12 seconds, please. And if we can play it through to 2:40 and 51 seconds. And I want you to watch Special Agent Deedy's body language here. And then from there, it picks up, and that's where we have the identification that we just talked about. That body language is not the body language of someone with the intent to kill. It's not the body language of someone who's trying to be aggressive. He's got his hands in his pockets. He's flat-footed. He's relaxed. He puts out his hands to Colin Elders. Hey, just drop this thing. That's what we see. Shane Medeiros wants to say that Special Agent Deedy said, I'm going to shoot you. I'm going to shoot you in the face. Whatever numerous varieties that they've said that Special Agent Deedy apparently said according to Shane Medeiros. Does that make sense, given the evidence that we have? It doesn't. Once Colin Elders saw that Special Agent Deedy was a law enforcement officer, he's the one who generates the first comment. He says, you're going to have to shoot me. Special Agent Deedy in response, shoot you? Why would Colin Elders even say that? It makes no sense. Colin Elders is the one who started this language. Special Agent Deedy didn't say, I'm going to shoot you in the face. When he originally walked over, what he said to him is, hey, you need to knock this off. You could be arrested if you assault someone. That's what Special Agent Deedy testified. That's what his body language is consistent with. Giving a warning, saying, hey, knock it off or you'll be arrested. Colin Elders, what was his response while he's seated at the table? You want beef too? I'll fuck you up. That's what Colin Elders said in response to Special Agent Deedy walking up. Now, if we can take the video to the cashier view at 2:41:27, please. What we're going to look at here is the frames that lead up to the initial kick from Special Agent Deedy. At this point, Colin Elders is standing up. It's hard to see him right in this frame. He's sort of here behind Jessica West. We can go to the next frame, please. Now we can see Colin Elders more clearly. There's Jessica West in front of Special Agent Deedy. Colin Elders is right there. Next frame, please. Again, we sort of lose Colin Elders at this point. Next frame. We can sort of see that plaid shirt, a little difficult. Again, Jessica West basically blocking him. Next frame. This one's key. 2:41:33. Special Agent Deedy has not moved at this point. He's been standing still the entire time. Notice this open space. There's nobody there in that open space right there. Next frame. And all of a sudden, Special Agent Deedy is still not moved. Colin Elders has moved into his space at 2:41:35. He has filled that empty space. Special Agent Deedy has not moved, but Colin Elders has moved directly into him, as he's been trying to do numerous times. People have been trying to hold him back. And then the next frame, Special Agent Deedy responds with a kick. Notice this left foot has still not moved. He did not go into Colin Elders. Colin Elders came into him, and he responded with a defensive kick. Now, if we can take it to the front dining view, please, and back up to the same time. Notice what we have right here at 2:41:27. People are trying to get Colin Elders to lay off. You've got Jessica West right there. Next frame. Next frame. Next frame. Next frame. Colin Elders keeps going forward. Goes right past Jessica West. Next frame. Next frame. He goes right into Special Agent Deedy. Now if we can switch back to the cashier view, please. At this point, what has happened? Special Agent Deedy responds to Colin Elders' attack with a defensive kick. Once that physical contact happens, that's felony assault on a federal officer. That's what had occurred at that time. We can play it now to, we're just going to play it straight through to 241.53. And I want you to watch what Special Agent Deedy does. Notice at this point, he's put his right hand back on his pistol. And what did he do? He went to the hand of the pistol, just like we saw Sergeant Schreiner do. Even when Sergeant Schreiner had Officer Naki, who's already handcuffing Special Agent Deedy, once he hears that he's got the gun, Sergeant Schreiner instinctively goes to his firearm, then puts his hand down. That's what Special Agent Deedy does. His hand goes to his firearm. He's just been attacked. He doesn't know if more attack is coming. But once he reassesses, the hand goes back down. He's assessed it's not a deadly force situation. The front kick was sufficient to deal with the threat that was right there. His hand goes back down. Restraint. That's what we see over and over again from Special Agent Deedy when he's confronted by Colin Eldridge, is restraint. Now, at this point, 241.53, we have, again, pretty fuzzy, hard to see, but we've got Colin Eldridge and Adam Gutowski clearly in contact. What's the name? Are they grappling? Are they punching? I don't think any of the testimony is clear on that. They're clearly in contact. Next frame. Colin Eldridge is still in the same place in the next frame. Not Adam Gutowski. He's in the door frame. Who was on the losing end of that one? Adam Gutowski was. Next frame. All of a sudden, Shane Medeiros has closed from across here. Now he attacks Adam Gutowski. First it's Colin Eldridge, then it's Adam Gutowski. Excuse me. First it's Colin Eldridge, then it's Shane Medeiros directly attacking Adam Gutowski. At this point, notice Special Agent Deedy's hand's not on his weapon even. Next frame. The door opens back here. Adam Gutowski has been pushed through the door by Shane Medeiros' attack. Colin Eldridge is attacking directly into Special Agent Deedy, and notice, he's reaching low. He wants that leg. He wants to take him down. Notice at this point also what has gone on. Rosalinda Soriano is on the phone. She's talking to 911. She had already told everyone she was calling 911. Special Agent Deedy knew that the police were already being called. He knew that they would be there shortly. The prosecution wants to say he had to personally call 911. No, he didn't. Once a security card says, I'm calling 911, it's a pretty competent person. He's not entrusting it to an 8-year-old. He's entrusting it to a security guard, a trained professional at McDonald's. Next frame. Shane Medeiros directly over Adam Gutowski, who's on the ground. Colin Eldridge clearly has been very effective in whatever type of move he was doing here, whether it's a punch, a tackle, whatever you want to call it. Special Agent Deedy's going backwards. He's slammed into the hand sanitizer, and he's going down. You can see the position of Colin Eldridge. He has all his force into it. He's the aggressor. There's no doubt. Next frame. Special Agent Deedy is hit so hard that his feet are in the air. This is not a light tap like Brendolyn Saltzbrenner wanted to suggest. Those were light lickings or whatever the words were that she used. This is an assault that sends him on the ground to his back with his feet in the air. And what does Colin Eldridge immediately do? As soon as he gets him down, he turns to go and join Shane Medeiros over Adam Gutowski. The prosecution wants you to think that he's interceding. He's not interceding. Shane Medeiros is kicking and beating Adam Gutowski on the ground. Next frame. Colin Eldridge joins Shane Medeiros while Adam Gutowski is still on the ground. Special Agent Deedy, he's getting up to his feet. He's on his knees at this point. He's getting up as quickly as he can. Now he's been assaulted for the second time. Colin Elders clearly has no problem using deadly force. Deadly force has been used by Colin Elders as soon as he dropped Special Agent Deedy to the ground. Ken Amiano from the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center made it clear. When an officer goes to the ground, that is a deadly force situation. They've been overwhelmed by the individual. That's what happened. Next frame. Special Agent Deedy gets up. Does he draw his gun at this point? No. Goes like this, arms out. Stop, I'll shoot. He hasn't even drawn his weapon. He doesn't want to shoot anybody. He wants them to stop. But he's using the threat of deadly force. He's telling him what he's going to do to get them to stop. Next frame. Colin Elders clearly hears him. He immediately turns around and comes right back at him. Next frame. Colin Elders continues to come into him. Special Agent Deedy puts his arm out. His hand is back to his pistol. He has not drawn his weapon. This is not him trying to kill someone. If he was trying to kill someone, he would already pulled out and shot. That's not what he's doing. He's trying to get him to stop. At this point, he says, freeze. Next frame. Notice what he does at that point. So in between these two frames is our best guess from the video as to when the shots went off, because this is the first time we see this reaction from the workers in the McDonald's. So in between the previous frame and this frame, that first shot goes off. What has he done? He's gone backwards and turned to the side to draw him offline. Special Agent Deedy is trying to make sure that any round that he fires is not going to endanger anyone else nearby. He's using his, even if he doesn't draw him offline, just the close quarters draw from the hip. He angles the round up. It's going to go up, and if it hits Colin Elders, it's going to hit him. But if it misses him, it's then going to go high over everyone else. And what evidence do we have to support it? You saw where the two bullets hit in the McDonald's. Both of them go high in the wall, higher than anybody's head. Shows that he did exactly what he was trained to do in a close quarters shoot like that. He was trained to deal with the possibility that innocent people could be nearby, and he took the appropriate action to defend himself once he was faced with deadly force, but also to make sure that no one else is injured. Next frame. Colin Elders continues to assault directly into him. Special Agent Deedy continues to back up. He's not attacking into Colin Elders. Colin Elders is attacking directly into him. The prosecution wants you to think that that's where the second round is fired, that this is when Colin Elders is shot. But Dr. Arden made it clear, and the video makes it clear, you can't get that shot. His hand is like this. You can't get the shot to get the angle from right here. This is not when the shot happens. We can switch it over to the front dining view, please. So we're still at the same time frame. We can see Colin Elders attacking into Special Agent Deedy. Next frame. And they're on the ground at this point. Colin Elders is clearly on top. There's no doubt. Next frame. Now what do we see here with Colin Elders? His body has come up. In the previous frame, he's very low. Now all of a sudden, we see his arm come up. It's difficult to make out given the graininess of the video, but you can see that arm come up. His shirt is coming away. His belly is exposed as he goes like this. Special Agent Deedy testified he fires off 2 more rounds from the ground. The trajectory that we see remember what Dr. Dial was testified early on. She said if the body was tilted like that, this torso, that would be consistent with the round that actually goes in and kills Colin Elders. That's when that shot happens. It's while it's on the ground. It's not in the previous frame where Special Agent Deedy is up there. It's when he's on the ground, when Colin Elders is continuing to punch him in the face. Special Agent Deedy uses deadly force because he's facing deadly force. Next frame. And then that's where we really don't see anything more happen. At that point, Special Agent Deedy has finally stopped the threat. Colin Eldert's death is tragic. There's no doubt about that. But Colin Eldert's decisions that day were tragic as well. He chose to put himself in an intoxicated state with marijuana, cocaine, and alcohol. And then he chose to disregard the reasonable instructions of a law enforcement officer. Those were the choices Colin Eldert's made. The prosecution is arguing that Colin Eldert's was defending himself, that he is responding to Special Agent Deedy's use of deadly force. Colin Eldert's is the one that took this to deadly force. First, we have the threat of serious bodily injury and deadly force against Adam Gutowski. He's on the ground, being kicked and beaten, at one point by both Colin Eldert's and Shane Medeiros. That warrants a deadly force response. That warrants Special Agent Deedy to defend Adam Gutowski, who's on the ground. But before he can even take effective action, he himself gets taken to the ground by Colin Eldert's. And so now the deadly force has been applied directly against Special Agent Deedy. The prosecution wants you to think that Special Agent Deedy was inexperienced, too young to be able to handle a situation like this. What this video shows is that he did precisely what he was trained to do. They want to criticize the fact that he says his front kick went a little too high, that he missed the first round with regard to Colin Eldert's. These are fluid situations. This is not a sterile classroom environment. This is a real person trying to kill Special Agent Deedy. That's what's going on. Those actions are never going to be perfect. The kick went a little high. The kick still connected. The kick still did exactly what it was supposed to do. It was to create space, to keep his reactionary gap, to prevent Colin Eldert's from coming in. It did exactly what it was supposed to do. Colin Eldert's was maneuvering on him while he takes that first shot. That happens. Again, Colin Eldert's wasn't just standing there. He was attacking directly into him. And what did he do, consistent with his training, that shows his maturity? He knows how to properly execute the use of his weapon. He knows how to properly use deadly force so that no one else is endangered by what he does. Consider what Special Agent Deedy does immediately after the shooting. He gets out from underneath Colin Eldert's. He's completely dazed. He talked about how time almost seemed like it stood still while he's being attacked by Colin Eldert's. He gets up in a daze after having just shot a man in the chest, looks for his slippers, and then all of a sudden he realizes, boom, he clicks back into what he's been trained to do. I've got to render aid. He goes over and he gets down and he renders aid. He does exactly what he's supposed to do. It's a responsible and mature reaction to the situation that he's faced with. He continues to provide aid until EMS arrives, and only then does he turn it over to them. He cooperates fully with the police officers. No fight. When they come up to him, what do we see on the Mace video, on Defense Exhibit C1? He says, "I'm the one who shot him." He's not hiding from anything. And they ask him about weapons. "It's on my right hip." He tells them exactly where his weapon is. He does exactly what he's been trained to do in a shooting like this, to cooperate with local law enforcement, because he knows he's likely to be arrested, because they don't know what's happened. They don't know that he's just acted in self-defense. He makes no further statements without having an agency representative present, because that's what he was trained to do, consistent with his training. He wouldn't give the breath test, the intoxilizer test, because that's what he was trained to do, to submit to no tests, to give no statements. You only give biodata, name, where you live, who you work for. He gives that, and consistent with training, he does nothing more. The prosecution wants to criticize Special Agent Deedy because he says he's still assessing to this day what happened. Any responsible law enforcement officer would say the same thing. They would look back and say, did I do the right thing? But more importantly, when he's thinking about that assessing, he can never know what was in Colin Eldred's head, why Colin Eldred would react the way that he did. Now, let's talk. Connor, how much time do I have?
Probably about 45 minutes.
Let's talk about applying the jury instructions to the facts that we've just talked about. Was what Special Agent Deedy did objectively reasonable? What are the factors that go into that? We begin with the fact that he identifies himself as a law enforcement officer. Prosecution wants to say no one else heard it. Well, Jessica West talked. She essentially had no audio memories almost of that entire night. Again, she's honest enough to say, I don't really remember what was said at all. I couldn't hear any specific words. That's the way her memory worked. Different people have different memory problems when you go through a situation like this. We heard about that from Ken Amiano, talking about auditory exclusion, tunnel vision, things that people go through. Not just the people involved in the physical fight, but people who were just close enough as eyewitnesses. But the video makes clear that Special Agent Deedy did identify himself as a law enforcement officer. He does it right to Colin Eldred's, and Shane Medeiros claims that it didn't happen. But the video makes it clear that it did. The prosecution wants to suggest that what Special Agent Deedy did escalated the situation. He didn't escalate the situation. He did what a law enforcement officer should do when someone is being threatened. When Mikhail Perrine is being threatened, he just goes up, identifies himself. That's the appropriate thing for a law enforcement officer to do. What kind of law enforcement officers do we want in society? Those that walk away? Those that ignore situations of threats to other people? Is that what we really want? The jury instructions specifically provide that when someone is a law enforcement officer, they have no obligation to desist. They specifically draft this in the law because we want law enforcement officers to be involved in situations like this. We don't want them to walk away. The prosecution wants him to retreat. That's not what is good for society. Colin Eldred gets angry when Special Agent Deedy identifies himself as a law enforcement officer. He reacts unreasonably. He does what no rational person does. When Colin Eldred finally gets the opportunity to attack, after all these other people have tried to hold him back, he attacks into Special Agent Deedy. What response does Special Agent Deedy have? A front kick. The preferred response, from what Ken Amiano told us, it's the ideal. It keeps the most distance. It's nice and low. It's a low use of force. He responds appropriately to the situation. He puts his hand on his pistol, but he doesn't draw, because at that point, it's not deadly force. He never draws his weapon until after deadly force has been used against him. What else is going on while Special Agent Deedy is making his assessment as to what he should do? Colin Eldred and Shane Medeiros are beating Adam Gutowski while he's on the ground. At one point, Special Agent Deedy saw Adam Gutowski's head against the door frame. He saw blood coming out of his head. What was it objectively reasonable for him to think at that point? That Adam Gutowski was facing at least serious bodily injury, if not deadly force. Common sense tells us that a single good kick to the head can kill someone. That's fundamental. It's common sense. What happens from there? Colin Eldredge attacks into Special Agent Deedy and takes him to the ground. So now deadly force has been applied not just to Adam Gutowski, but to Special Agent Deedy directly. Now the prosecution, I don't know what they're going to say when they come back up. They're going to say, well, he should have arrested him. This is what you do to make an arrest. You have to get a person in a position where you can effect the arrest. When someone's attacking you, you have to subdue them first. He identified himself early on at the table, said, I'm a law enforcement officer. He tells them, you'll be arrested if you attack anybody, if you assault anybody. But that doesn't deter Colin Eldredge. Once Special Agent Deedy gets dropped to the ground, once deadly force is used against him personally, he gets up and he still does not draw his weapon. He gets up, puts those hands out, tells him, stop, I'll shoot. He warns about the use of deadly force. He threatens it in an attempt to get Colin Eldredge to stop.
Excuse me, Mr. Blunkey. Ladies and gentlemen, do you want to go grab a sandwich? Or do you want to try to finish this? We can break for maybe 40 minutes, come back at 1:15 to finish these matters. It's up to you. Feel like...
Let's finish it.
Let's finish it? Okay. I think Bilani's okay. All right, I'm sorry, Mr. Blunkey. Right over. Go ahead.
He gets up, he puts his arms out, stop, I'll shoot. He threatens deadly force, but does not even draw his weapon yet. Colin Eldredge immediately turns away from the double team that he's doing on Adam Gutowski with Shane Medeiros. Comes at Special Agent Deedy. Special Agent Deedy backs up, puts his hand to his weapon, still hasn't drawn at this point, arm out. He's doing everything that he can to get Colin Eldredge to stop without using deadly force. But Colin Eldredge keeps coming. He finally draws his weapon. And what does Colin Eldredge do? Not only does he continue to attack into him, he grabs for his weapon. When someone grabs for a law enforcement officer's weapon, that is deadly force. Ken Amiano made it absolutely clear. When someone comes at a law enforcement officer and grabs for their weapon while it's in their hand, that is a deadly force situation. And federal law enforcement officers are trained to shoot at that point. That's the reality. There's no getting around it. It is deadly force. This is the second time now that Colin Eldredge has used deadly force as he attacks into Special Agent Deedy. As he's doing that, right before that last draw, again, he tells him to freeze. He doesn't. He continues to come into him. Ultimately, Colin Eldredge gets Special Agent Deedy on his back. He's on top of him. He continues to punch him in the face and head, while Special Agent Deedy's head is against the ground. He's doing everything that he can
Objection.
to keep his...
Excuse me, there's been an objection.
Misstatement of the evidence.
Sustained.
He's doing everything he can to keep his head up off the ground, to prevent any further serious injury from what Colin Eldredge is doing. But the blows keep coming. What is reasonable for Special Agent Deedy to do at this point? He's faced with a continuous barrage of deadly force from Colin Eldredge. he uses deadly force in response, which the jury instructions make clear that he is authorized to do. He fires those 2 rounds, one of which goes into Colin Eldred's, the other which, again, goes high. He specifically does that to make sure that there is no unreasonable danger to other people in the McDonald's. And again, we know that it worked because we saw where those rounds hit the wall. His actions are reasonable under the circumstances. The prosecution has the burden of proof in this case. They must prove the elements of both counts, both the murder and the possession of a firearm in the commission of a separate felony, beyond a reasonable doubt. They haven't done it. They haven't. The evidence is clear that what Special Agent Deedy did was act reasonably. They haven't disproven any one of the 3 defenses either. Special Agent Deedy did what was reasonable under the circumstances when faced with serious bodily injury and deadly force from Colin Eldred's. You are the jury of Chris Deedy's peers. You are the ones who have heard the evidence, and you will be the ones who make the decision in this case. The facts speak for themselves. The video makes clear what Special Agent Deedy did. Special Agent Deedy did not attack Colin Eldred's. Colin Eldred's attacked him. He attacked him, and he committed a felony directly against Special Agent Deedy. Colin Eldred's attacked Adam Gutowski while he was on the ground. Special Agent Deedy did what was right in defending himself, in defending Adam Gutowski, and in acting as a law enforcement officer when faced with deadly force. Because of that, we ask you to return because of that, we ask you to return a verdict of not guilty on both counts. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Victor?
I'm going to tell you why this is not a case of self-defense, defense of others, or use of deadly force by a law enforcement officer. It's not, because none of these defenses were justified. Now, with respect to self-defense, you've been given the instruction, and you can have it with you. And it involves a consideration of 2 issues, and as I think we've discussed, and it's pretty obvious that the first issue, whether deadly force was used, is a non-issue. There's no doubt what happened here was deadly force. Firing a gun in somebody's direction is deadly force. So then the second issue you have to look at is whether or not the force that was used was justified. Now, it's only justified in self-defense if the use of deadly force if the defendant reasonably believes that the use of deadly force is immediately necessary to protect himself against death or serious bodily injury. So there are several elements here. One is reasonably or immediately necessary. It has to be immediately necessary. It's not that, oh yeah, something bad is happening to me, but if I do anything else, then it might alleviate the situation. It has to be immediate. You have to think, I'm being killed, I'm being seriously injured now, before you can even begin to consider the use of deadly force. Now, and again, serious bodily injury has a very specific definition. It's just not a broken nose. It's not a 1 centimeter laceration to your scalp. It's not a black eye. It's not a contusion. It's not a bruise. It is serious bodily injury that can cause death or cause permanent impairment to a major organ of your body or serious disfigurement. So that's what you have to be afraid of. That's what has to be happening to you. Not just getting dirty lickings. That does not count for serious bodily injury. Serious bodily injury has to put you in danger of death or, as I said, permanent disfigurement or injury. And that's why, in this case, the defendant is not able to claim self-defense, because when he says that Colin assaulted him by the defendant kicking Colin, and I'm not sure, well, that's his statement to you, but that the state would submit is the defendant kicking Colin Elderts. Nevertheless, he claims that as the first assault. No question but that serious bodily injury is not involved in that encounter.
Excuse me, Ms. Fujian, may I just remind the jury that serious bodily injury means bodily injury which creates a substantial risk of death or which causes serious permanent disfigurement or protracted loss or impairment of the function of any bodily member or organ. I'm sorry to interrupt. Please proceed.
So let's look at the second assault on defendant, and that is when he is spear tackled to the ground. Being spear tackled to the ground does not constitute serious bodily injury. This does not put you in a position where you might be dead or even receive serious bodily injury. And because of this, this was not an appropriate time to pull out your gun. It's not as if Colin Elderts, after he spear tackled the defendant to the ground, then turned around and got an instrument and started beating on defendant Deedy. That's not what happened. Colin Elderts turned away from defendant Deedy at that point. He turned away. There was no serious bodily injury going on here or contemplated by Colin Elderts against the defendant. Now, again, there is a justification that has to be met before you can find that he can use this. And the defendant in this case has said that, okay, maybe at that point I wasn't defending myself, but I was defending my friend, Adam Gutowski. So let's look now at what's happening to Adam Gutowski. He is getting, according to Jessica West, his girlfriend, and the defendant, kicked and beaten by Shane Medeiros at the door. And they say that Colin Elderts went and was going to help him, was going to help Shane, and actually started beating Shane as well. Yet other witnesses to the event who aren't related to the defendant or Jessica West or Adam Gutowski, who really have no beef in this, say that Colin Elderts was never beating on Shane Medeiros. He was not kicking on him. In fact, Brendan Salzbrenner said he went to intercede to try to get Shane to stop. Alexander Bird used that same word too. He went to intercede. The only people who are talking about Colin Eldredge, after turning away from the defendant on the floor, kicking Adam Gutowski, is, as I said, Jessica West and the defendant. Nevertheless, if you want to believe that the defendant reasonably believed that Adam Gutowski was in danger of death or serious bodily injury, the state would submit that you have to look at all of the evidence and think, would a reasonable person in the defendant's situation or in Adam Gutowski's situation think that he was in danger of death or serious bodily injury? No. He was in danger of getting he was in danger of getting beat up. There were no weapons. The only person that had any weapons that night was the defendant. He had the gun. He had the knife. Otherwise, it was hand to hand. It was a fight. It wasn't a situation that required somebody to pull a gun and shoot it. The state would submit that under these undisputed circumstances, this trained federal agent cannot credibly argue that he was in immediate danger of death or serious bodily injury when he fired the first shot at Colin Eldredge. And he cannot credibly claim that a person in his situation thought that Adam Gutowski was in that danger either. But you heard the defendant testify. You heard the defendant testify that, yeah, at that point when I saw Colin Eldredge and Shane Medeiros attacking Adam Gutowski, and it's always attacking Adam Gutowski, I could have shot Shane Medeiros at that time too and be perfectly justified. And the defense asks you, is this the kind of law enforcement person that you want, someone who will walk away? And I would ask you this in turn. Is this the kind of law enforcement officer you want walking around your Honolulu, your Waikiki? Some guy who sees another guy in a fist fight and thinks that he can pull his gun and blow that person away? No. The answer has to be no. That's not the kind of law enforcement officer we want. Now, with respect to the use of deadly, and the defense of others things has the same considerations, except that in the defense of others defense, the defendant has to put himself in the shoes of, in this case, Adam Gutowski. And Adam Gutowski has to have a reasonable belief that he's getting seriously injured or in danger of death. And in this case, for the same arguments, I would submit that that just is not happening here, ladies and gentlemen. There is no danger of death. There is no serious bodily injury. Look at the injuries that actually happened. As Dr. Perry testified, first to the defendant, he was complaining of pain to his nose and his jaw. Upon palpation by Dr. Perry, there was tenderness to the nose. He noticed some dried blood in the nostrils. Tenderness to the nose, dried blood to the nostrils, no interference with breathing, no other signs of any injury to the nose. He makes a clinical diagnosis of a broken nose. Clinical diagnosis, no x-rays, nothing. Upon palpation to the jaw, the other area that the defendant complained of pain to, no pain, nothing. So the defendant is released, no treatment, no medications, nothing. The defendant did not complain of pain to any other part of his body. He did not complain of pain to the back of his head, although they're now trying to make you believe that he was beaten so severely the back of his head was receiving injuries. No complaint of pain there at all. with respect to Adam Gutowski's injuries, yeah, he got beat up. He got a black eye, basically. He got a big contusion to the left side of his cheekbone. And yeah, he had a cut to his head, a 1 centimeter laceration to his scalp, and that was bleeding. And defendant would have you believe that he was able to see that bleeding after he got up and saw Adam Gutowski on the floor where both Shane Medeiros and Colin Elderts were between the defendant and Adam Gutowski. When even Adam's girlfriend, Jessica West, said that she didn't see the bleeding until after the shots were fired, when Adam and she were both in the McDonald's looking to see who had fallen and what had happened. That's the first time that she noticed the blood on Adam. But the defendant would have you believe otherwise, that he could see between these two fellows, Colin Elderts and Shane Medeiros, that the defendant was bleeding and, oh my gosh, I thought he was in danger of death or serious bodily injury. No, that just did not happen. And so, if Adam Gutowski cannot claim that privilege for himself, the defendant cannot claim it on behalf of Adam Gutowski. And if the defendant cannot claim the privilege of self-defense just because he was knocked to the ground by Colin Elderts and he got up 2 seconds later, he cannot claim that for himself either, because he was not in danger of death or serious bodily injury when he pulled that gun. When he pulled that gun and called Colin Elderts back. And that first shot that he took at Colin Elderts was totally unjustified. He was not in danger of death or serious bodily injury, and he has to be before you can shoot somebody. Colin Elderts, as the defendant testified, is approaching the defendant when the defendant has his gun out. Colin Elderts is walking slowly. Colin Elderts has his arms at his side. The defendant nonetheless pulls his gun and shoots him and misses. From an arm's length away, he misses. What does that tell you? That tells you that this expert marksman, something else was happening at that time. And I would submit to you, it tells you he was intoxicated. And that's why he missed. Not once, but twice at very close range. He missed. Also, if I may have a slide for the when you're not able to use. You are also instructed that the use of deadly force is not justifiable if the defendant, with the intent of causing death or serious bodily injury, provoked the use of force against himself in the same encounter. So what does that mean? That means that if the defendant started all of this, started this whole thing, and provoked the use of force against himself, he's not allowed to claim self-defense if he intended to cause death or serious bodily injury. Now, we're not saying, again, that the defendant went there to McDonald's that night to cause a fracas. He did not go there to be able to use his gun and kill somebody. What the state submits to you is that what built up to the ultimate first shot was, in fact, orchestrated by the defendant, because he was the one who took those steps. He was the one who aggravated the situation. We don't know why he did that, but he did, and he recognized that he did. He recognized that what he was doing was not de-escalating any situation. He recognized that what he was doing was, in fact, getting everybody, Colin Elderts, more heated up and more angry. But he would not stop. No, he continued at him again and again. And remember the testimony, ladies and gentlemen, from the defendant when he said, when I asked, why didn't you just walk away? Why didn't you just call the police? He said, because it was my responsibility, because I started it. And therefore, it was my responsibility to be there to the end. This,
Your Honor, objection to mischaracterization of Mr. Deedy's testimony. He never said that he started it.
All right, sustain.
he said it was his responsibility. It was his responsibility, and he needed to see this to the end. So within this whole framework of responsibility, he was the one who first went up there. He was the one who agitated the situation. This was not in conformance with his training. Both Mr. Blanqui and the defendant would have you believe that everything the defendant did was in conformity with his training. You recall the testimony of the defendant. If he said it once, he said it more than 165 times, that this is what we are trained to do. He said it like a mantra, as if this would protect him from any bad consequence, that if you do what you're trained to do, nothing bad will happen. If you do what you're trained to do, then you're doing something within the law. And yet, you remember the testimony of Kenneth Amiano, the trainer at FLETC, who said, you can do everything 100% correct, you can do everything according to your training, and still be wrong. It's because it's the agent that has the discretion as to what training tools to use. And if he chooses the wrong tools, or if he chooses to use them incorrectly, he cannot rely and fall back and say, it was my training, so I'm okay. Now, with respect to the use of deadly force, the second reason that deadly force is not justifiable is if the defendant, and this is both for defense of self and defense of others, is if the use of deadly force is not justifiable, if the defendant knows that he can avoid the necessity of using such force with complete safety by retreating. There you go. As Kenneth Amiano said, retreat in some situations is the better part of valor. Retreat is a tool that the defendant knew was available to him, but retreat is something he never, ever considered. Not after he was responsible for the situation that he created, not after this young, drunk kid bested him by, according to Shane Medeiros, after Colin Elders was kicked, Colin slapped the defendant in the face. How embarrassing is that? That is a slap in the face. He didn't punch him, he just slapped him in the face. How do you think that that sat with a trained agent with the State Department? I would submit not well. And there was no way the defendant was backing off from this situation. And then again, Colin Elders, the drunk, Colin Elders, pushes the defendant, spear tackles him to the ground. How do you think that sat with the special agent from the State Department? Not well, I would submit, and certainly he was not backing down after that. With respect to the other defense that the defendant relies on, the use of deadly force in law enforcement, this is even more stringent because it's only justified if the defendant was making a lawful arrest. Let's just stop right there. What he was doing with Colin Elders was not a lawful arrest. He had never announced it. Well, according to his testimony in court, he said at the very beginning, acting like this is going to get you arrested. Well, let's think about that for a second. Colin Elders had done nothing wrong at that point in time when the defendant says he made that statement. No crime had been committed. And so Colin Elders, if in fact this is what the defendant told him, you can imagine how Colin Elders was thinking. Why would I get arrested for
objection to mischaracterization of his testimony? He said, if you assault me, then you'll be arrested.
Well, the jury knows what the evidence is, and that's what you're going to consider. consider in accordance with all of my instructions. Please proceed.
So here he is faced with this situation. He's done nothing wrong. Nothing wrong. He's just sitting there waiting for his food so he can go back to the hotel. And this guy comes up and, according to the defendant, says, you're going to be arrested if you keep this up. That's coming out of the blue. That is making no sense in the situation. And so, yes, Colin Elderts gets angry. Who would not? Because who is this guy? He's not on duty. He's wearing shorts and slippers. He's drunk. And he's coming up and saying this to you out of the blue. None of his business, but out. So, was he making a lawful arrest at that time? He never said so. And was this for a felony for which he reasonably believes involves the use of or threatened use of deadly force? And there you go again. Deadly force has to be a part of this component. In other words, the felony that you are supposedly making a lawful arrest for has to involve the use of deadly force itself. In other words, if somebody's trying to kill another person, you can use deadly force when making that lawful arrest. But you can't use it just because somebody is getting beat up. The defendant reasonably believes that deadly force is immediately necessary to effect a lawful arrest. Again, we have that situation, immediately necessary. In this case, when he gets up from being on the floor, is it immediately necessary to pull your gun and arrest Colin Elderts? Or could the defendant have gone over, pulled Colin Elderts off of off of Adam Gutowski, and broken up the fight using his hands? Which is exactly what Jessica West did, and exactly what Joey Keane did when they pushed Shane Medeiros out the door. They broke it up. They stopped it, and there was no injury to either of them. So I would submit that neither one nor two have been met. And you notice it doesn't say or after these conditions, it's and. Every one of these conditions must be met before a law enforcement officer can justify the use of deadly force. So 3, the defendant makes known the purpose of the arrest. Well, no, we know that didn't happen. And the defendant is authorized to act as a law enforcement officer. Well, maybe that one is okay. Under certain situations, the federal officer may be making a federal arrest, not for any state crime, but a federal arrest that he knows has been committed. But that arrest, again, still has to be for a felony that involves serious bodily injury or the threatened use of deadly force. So, the next and, subsection 5, the defendant reasonably believes that the force employed creates no substantial risk of injury to innocent persons. There is no way that this condition can be met by the defendant in a crowded McDonald's, no matter how much he says he was trained to shoot close quarters up so there would be nobody in danger. This is a crowded McDonald's. The defendant missed his first 2 shots. There is no way that he can say that he reasonably believed that shooting a gun in a crowded McDonald's created no substantial risk of injury to innocent persons. Absolutely.
I've got an objection to the slide as presented by the prosecution. It misstates the jury instructions. If you look at page 35 of the jury instruction journal.
And you as jurors have access to the whole instruction. This is the essence of the instruction as the state sees it, and these are the
with regard
elements
to,
with.
Your Honor, we have an objection.
Which number?
Number 3, Your Honor, on page 35.
All right.
The
Well,
prosecution slide, just make it clear for the record, Your Honor, says the defendant makes known the purpose of the arrest. The actual jury instruction says makes known the purpose of the arrest or reasonably believes that the purpose of the arrest is otherwise known by or cannot reasonably be made known to the person to be arrested.
all right. The jury has the jury instructions, and that is what they are going to follow.
And There's no reason to believe that Colin Elders knows why he's being arrested, or that the defendant, who's standing there according to his own testimony, can't say what he's being arrested for. Every one of these conditions, ladies and gentlemen, has to be met before the defendant can claim use of force in law enforcement. And if these conditions aren't met, he can't claim this defense, and if he can't claim this defense, he is just like any other citizen when it comes to trying to use the defense of self-defense or defense of others, just like you or me. He has to follow all of those elements, especially, or he is not justified in using deadly force. Now, again, there's been a discussion about the angle of the bullet and which bullet hit him, and I would submit, the state would submit, that this is not important in this case. What is important is that the first time the gun was drawn and shot, there was no legally justifiable reason for the defendant to do it. And if when the first shot was fired, there was no legally justifiable reason for the defendant to do so, then all the other shots, the second and third, which follow, also fall within that same use of force construct. It's not like the defendant fired once, put his gun away, and then a whole different set of circumstances occurred. In this case, the defendant pulled his gun out, fired, missed, and then we have Colin Elders fighting for his life at that point in time, trying to get the gun pointed away from him, trying to get at the defendant so the defendant cannot fire at him again. This is all one continuous action. And therefore, the first shot was not justified, neither can the second or third be. Because after the first shot is fired, Colin Elders, like anybody, like you or I or anybody else, has the absolute right to defend himself against what is obviously deadly force. Somebody's trying to shoot you. What are you going to do? Maybe some of us would have left. We would probably have left a long time before this ever happened. But Colin Elders did it. He was trying to defend himself. He was trying to get that gun pointed away, pointed any place but at himself. Unfortunately, he was unable to do so. But the reason we talk about which gunshot did it is just as a matter of basically forensics. What happened here? No. The state is not arguing that the second shot occurred while they were in that position that we see in the video, parallel to the counter, moving towards the high chair area. It happened after that. It happened after that, right after that, shortly after that, while they were falling perhaps, because that's when Colin would be in the perfect position according to where the bullet went in and where it was found. Not if the defendant were on the ground, and as the defendant tried to show you, that positioning would be almost impossible to get the angle that was found with the bullet. But I would submit the reason the defendant wants you to consider that it was not the second shot, but was something, was the third shot, was because he's saying now that Colin is beating him so hard that he is now in danger of himself of death or serious bodily injury. But again, ladies and gentlemen, consider the evidence. Alexander Bird, whom they have tried to discredit, but when you think about it, Alexander Bird really has he has no loyalties to either side here. He just saw what he saw. And he saw the defendant on the ground with his hands being held. He said that by the time the defendant and Colin fell down, the shots had been fired. There were no shots after that. And we know why there couldn't be a shot after the third, because it was jammed. And based upon the evidence that we have about how Colin Eldridge was trying to get the gun away, how the defendant obviously does not have good control over the gun because he keeps missing, how that could have happened, as Cindy Lorenzo explained, by the limp wrist, not a good grip on the gun, and having the slide pick up some of the momentum of the limp wrist, thereby not being able to eject the cartridge. That makes perfect sense in this scenario, a limp-wristed jam. It makes perfect sense in the scenario that the defendant had no control over the gun. He couldn't even shoot someone that was an arm's length away. Ladies and gentlemen, I would submit that based upon the evidence, as a juror, you can only say that the defendant was not justified because the law does not allow him to use this justification, definitely not as a law enforcement officer, but neither does it allow him to use this justification of self-defense or defense of others. He just does not meet that threshold. And that threshold, the main threshold being no serious bodily injury, no threat of death or death. Ladies and gentlemen, the defense has argued that there has been no evidence of intoxication. Intoxication, I would submit to you, is not a blood alcohol numerical value, but it's whether alcohol has an effect on you. It affects you, whether drinking has affected you in any way. And now, so let's look at the evidence here. We have evidence that there was a 6-hour time difference or jet lag by the time the defendant got here. And you know that that will contribute to how you feel, tired, how the alcohol will affect you. In fact, the defendant's buddy, who is more responsible, recognized the problem, told the defendant, no, I'm not going out tonight. I'm all fucked up because of the time difference. Further evidence of the intoxication I would submit is that 5 bars, 6 hours later, and the defendant claims only 4 beers, more or less. I would submit that that's not reasonable, not when you're going out to meet your buddies, your friends, for a night of dinner and craziness. I would submit that the evidence at Coconut Willie's alone, the bar tab, shows that there was more that the defendant took than what he admitted to. There were 4 beers on that tab. When the defendant testified, he attributed one of the beers to Adam Gutowski. He said he ordered a beer for Adam Gutowski. Excuse me. Adam Gutowski testified to that the defendant ordered him a beer at Coconut Willie's. Now, why would that happen? The defendant doesn't, Adam Gutowski does not drink beer. He had been drinking bourbon all night. So now, why at Coconut Willie's would the defendant get him a beer? I would submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, the state would submit to you that they, meaning the defendant and Adam Gutowski and Jessica West, had to account for 4 beers at Coconut Willie's, which is clearly on the tab. The defendant admits to drinking 2. They say that 1 beer went to the flip cup game, and so now they're having Adam Gutowski cop to the 4th beer when that was never anything that he drank that whole night. Also, with respect to the defendant's statement of how he always has only...
No, objection. Adam Gutowski clearly did testify that he did drink beer that night.
This is argument. Jury is... Please proceed.
And ladies and gentlemen, with respect to Adam Gutowski's testimony, Jessica West's testimony, these communications majors, their testimony was very consistent with each other. And I would submit to you that you should look at that carefully and decide really what is true and what is not. With respect to the defendant's testimony about what was said and done that night, I would submit that it's going through that video, which is in evidence, frame by frame by frame, and then, yes, constructing a story about each frame and how it fits with his training each time. Over 165 times, ladies and gentlemen, he mentioned his training, his mantra. Now, we have, with respect to evidence of intoxication, the testimony of Brenda Salzbrenner. She thought that the defendant was tipsy. Alexander Bird specifically said the defendant had drunken rambling, is how he described the defendant's words. Not loud, but no context to what he was saying. He was talking trash. He was not speaking clearly. He was swaying back and forth, and yes, you can't see the swaying on the video, but that's what Alexander Bird testified to. He had trouble keeping his eyes open, it seemed like. He was trying to stay awake, and he seemed, according to Alexander Bird, fairly drunk. Now, Taylor L. Young also testified to seeing swaying, and she also testified to glassy eyes and the fact that the defendant was unsteady on his feet. Sergeant Schreiner testified to the smell of alcohol from his breath and also glassy eyes. And yes, so did the transporting officer, Soda. The smell, the eyes, unsteady on his feet. Toy Steck talked about smell of alcohol from his breath and from his body. Now, Mr. Blanke argues that the last person to see the defendant at Coconut Willie's was the bartendress who closed out his tab, and she said he didn't look drunk. Well, let's think about it, ladies and gentlemen. She is a bartendress at a bar who is closing out a tab with 9 drinks on it. She is not going to say that the defendant looked drunk, because they know that they're not supposed to be serving people under the influence. We have Ms. Barbette, the bartendress at Coconut Willie's, also noticed that the defendant was with someone, and that someone was Adam Gutowski, and he, by his own testimony, was in fact intoxicated and under the influence, and you can see the video and see that, yes, in fact, he was. Now, the state is not arguing that the defendant had had as much to drink as Adam or was as influenced as Adam by alcohol, but the state is arguing that based upon the evidence, he was in fact under the influence of alcohol. And no matter how much they want to argue that the policy of the State Department, who employed the defendant in November of 2005, does not govern, is not law. That's true, it is not law, but it is internal policy that all agents are required to follow upon pain of being, well, punished up to dismissal. And you know what? If you're dismissed as an agent with the State Department, then you no longer can claim to be a federal law enforcement officer under LEOSA, and you can't carry a gun at all. And so if you want to say, if they want to argue that LEOSA applies, that is, that it talks about being under the influence and that's all that matters, not whether you've had one drink or not, then they may do so. But I would submit that the evidence shows that he was in fact intoxicated. He was carrying a gun off duty. It was in contravention to his agency's policy. He should not have had that gun. Agent Golbus, you remember him testifying, and he did not want to admit that the FAM applied to off-duty or on-duty weapons. But finally, the final question, and that administrative policy, which is the FAM, which controls all of the special agents with the United States State Department, does not allow any agent on duty or off duty to carry a firearm if they drink. Is that correct? Answer: that is correct as now stated. That was the last question that he was asked, the last question that he answered. It took that long to get him to admit that yes, FAM applies to both on and off duty carrying. Now, when you're looking at evidence of intoxication, let's look to the actions of the defendant. Dr. Arden, their forensic pathologist, testified that alcohol decreases inhibitions, diminishes attention and control, impairs perception, decreases hand-eye coordination, adds to lack of coordination, and adds to loss of critical judgment. All of those things, ladies and gentlemen, the state would submit were in play with the defendant that morning at McDonald's. Assessing, reassessing, assessing, reassessing, no decisions. Unable to come to a decision in a situation where decisions, immediate decisions, are absolutely necessary. Unable to control hand-eye coordination such that you can shoot somebody who's an arm's length away. Unable to execute correctly your thrust kick that you have practiced and practiced and practiced. And unable to defend yourself against someone who is obviously drunk, unless you pull your gun. Ladies and gentlemen, let's talk about Colin Eldredge for a second and his intoxication level. Yeah, he was drunk. Yes, he was taking Pacololo. Defense would have you believe that he was also high on cocaine, but recall the testimony. The toxicology test did not find any cocaine in the bloodstream, did not find even the leftovers of cocaine, which have no effect in the bloodstream. Rather, what was found was cocaethylene in the vitreous humor, which is the liquid in your eyeball. And according to Dr. Arden, that would suggest that any cocaine that was taken with alcohol was taken way before the incident began. Maybe that day, but 10 hours or so more before the incident began. And that cocaine has a very short half-life. That you take cocaine and the peak is within an hour, and likewise the decrease is within an hour. So there's no effect after that time period. And here, if it had been 10 hours before the shooting, that was no effect of the cocaine. Definitely he was under the influence of alcohol and marijuana. Both of those are depressants. Both of those slow you down. They do not make you aggressive. Now, when we look at the actions that the defendant took that indicate his intoxication, we see poor choices from the very beginning. We see him drinking and carrying his weapon. We see him interfering in something that he had no business to interfere with. We see his inability to quickly assess the situation. We see his inability to correctly assess the situation. We see his poor choices of tools as an agent. We see that he is driven by ego, not by need. We see that he has inability to correctly execute his physical training tools such as the kick and or shooting, or even the close quarters draw. Because there is no argument that when they were coming across the counter, that is not a close quarters draw. The gun is here. Close quarters is here. And the reason it's close quarters is because you don't want somebody to be able to get control over it. It's here already. Colin is trying to push it away. Other circumstances that show that the defendant was intoxicated was basically letting a drunk, untrained kid best you at hand-to-hand fight. But the defendant could let that happen, ladies and gentlemen, because he knew that no matter what Colin Eldredge did to him, he, the defendant, had the ace in his pocket. He had the gun. Ladies and gentlemen, the defendant in this case created the situation which forced him to use deadly force. Recall the testimony of the FLETC trainer, Kenneth Amiano. Agents are not allowed to create a situation in which the force they use is in fact used. They're not allowed to take advantage of that. And that's exactly what happened here. he recognized, I would submit to you, the state would submit that when he went over and tried to talk to Colin, he knew or should have known that he had no business being there. When he had went over and tried to talk to Colin and Colin got angry about it, it was the defendant that upped the use of force then. It was the defendant that pulled out his credentials, upping the use of force. When that made Colin Elderts even more angry, for whatever reason, and the defendant couldn't figure it out, but that didn't matter. He knew Colin was not calming down. He knew he was making Colin more angry. He could have backed out at any time, but by that time his friends had come in. Maybe he didn't want to back down in front of his friends. Who knows? But we do know that his actions just kept making the situation worse and worse and worse, and he would not stop. And he put his friends in peril. He put everybody at McDonald's in peril by his actions, but he still would not stop until he killed Colin Elderts. He wasn't willing to back down. He wasn't willing to admit that this young kid, drunk by his own admission, this basically local punk, had gotten the better of him because he knew that he had his ace, the baby Glock. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not the kind of person that we want as a law enforcement agent. I would submit that the type of person that we want as a law enforcement agent is one who is mature, who is not running around under the influence and carrying a gun, who can make decisions quickly, particularly when you need to decide whether deadly force should be used or not, and is able to make the right decisions. And none of this happened there that morning at McDonald's on November 5th, 2011. Ladies and gentlemen, hubris. Hubris, the bully with the badge and his gun. This is what caused the unjustifiable killing of Colin Elderts on November 5th, 2011. And this is why justice demands that you find him guilty as charged.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, if you're unable to reach a verdict, you'll be excused around 4:30 in the afternoon and asked to return around 9 o'clock the next working day for further deliberations. To assist you in performing your duties, we'll provide you with the verdict forms, all exhibits. You have your jury instructions. We are going to give you all exhibits, but not State's Exhibit 5. When you want to see State's Exhibit 5, just write a communication, and the law clerks will go in there, give you State's Exhibit 5, but withdraw State's Exhibit 1. Okay, it's the way we do things in all of these cases, so don't worry about that. In addition, I always tell jurors, whatever the case, whatever the charge, we'll provide you with gloves. I always tell jurors, no matter what the kind of case, use gloves if you handle evidence, and always wash your hands after you've handled evidence. You've been allowed to take notes during this trial. When you leave the courtroom to begin deliberations, you must follow some important rules as to those notes. Notes can be used by you, and only by you, to assist in refreshing your memory of the evidence. They are not a substitute for your own independent memory of the evidence. Keep your notes to yourself. Do not show or read them to any other juror. You must not give certain evidence more weight simply because it appears in your notes, and do not assume that your notes are accurate or complete. Now, some of you chose not to take notes. If you did not take notes, you should rely on your memory of the evidence and should not be influenced by the fact that another juror may have taken notes. Notes are not entitled to any greater weight than the memory of each juror as to what the testimony may have been. Anytime you leave the jury room during deliberations, leave your notes face down on the table. And once you have reached a verdict, Ryan is going to collect your notes and, without reading them, destroy them. To our alternates, let's see. Complicated. Let's see. Ms. Baranava and Mr. Doyle. I want to thank you for all of your time. Now, there's a new rule that permits me to instruct you as follows. Please continue to follow my instructions until my staff calls you to discharge you permanently from this case. Okay, so, you know, keep an open mind, don't talk about this case, don't look at any media, all of my instructions. And my staff will be in contact with you. Okay? Can we have our bailiff sworn, please?
You do solemnly swear or affirm that you will take this jury in charge, that you will not communicate with them except by order of this court, that you allow no one to communicate with them, and that you will conduct them into court again whenever so requested by them or by order of the court.
All right, then I will thank again our two alternates and excuse you, subject to what I have instructed you to do, and our 12, excuse you into the jury room, and there, please, I instruct you to begin deliberations. You are excused.